Greetings from San Diego, California. This interactive multinational teleconference is reaching you live in English and Spanish through a unique and complex international telecommunications network via satellite, microwave, and cable. This program brings together distinguished institutions representing education, business, and government in more than a dozen countries in Americas and Europe. We would like to extend a special welcome to the Business Training Network and their network of sites throughout the United States, who are participating with us for the first time today. We look forward to hearing from all of you. During this video conference, we will examine the topic of workforce reconversion and the global market reinventing ourselves for new job opportunities. This is the first International Training Center video conference of the year 2003 series entitled Strategies for Competitive Performance. I'm Dr. Farhad Sabah, Professor of Educational Technology at San Diego State University and your moderator for today's program. The global workplace is creating new realities for organizations and communities around the world, increasing mobility, use of information technology, diversity, and multiculturalism are just a few of the dynamics that defines a new, highly competitive work environment. The growing challenge for today's employees and employers is to be capable of constantly, continuously adapting to these processes in order to benefit from opportunities as they arise in the marketplace. This translates into a need for constant and effective workforce reconversion and reinvention in terms of abilities, skills, attitudes, and productive competencies in general. This video conference will review these and other workplace issues crucial to productivity and global competitiveness. The invited speaker will review the challenges faced by organizations in the education, business, and government sectors that are working towards workforce reconversion at both the professional and technical levels. This program will also cover the benefits and costs of this process for both organizations and individuals, and the concept of productive reinvention as a lifelong training and human resource development effort. We welcome once again Mr. Charles Brass, past ITC speaker and the chairman of the Australian-based NGO, the Future of Work Foundation. The mission of this organization is to engage all Australians in creating a better future for work, a challenge Charles has embraced for the past 6 years. Charles's previous work experience includes that of entrepreneur, secondary school teacher, and 15 years in corporate human resources. The last 8 as director of a German-based multinational. He has been involved full-time with the Future of Work Foundation since 1995. Charles has spoken with audiences all around Australia and across the world and says he enjoys working with people who, like him, are struggling to put the profound changes in the workplace into some perspective for themselves. Along with this work experience, Charles holds many academic qualifications, including an honors science degree and an MBA. Welcome back, and thanks for being with us today. I'd like to begin asking you a question. As the pace of business and society in general increases and becomes more dynamic, we are forced to take more ownership of our jobs and careers than perhaps we were required to do before. Do you see opportunities here for companies, government organizations and educational institutions to capitalize on this increased effort by its employees?
Thank you for the question. Thanks for inviting me back again. And there is no doubt this is an exciting time for organisations of all kinds. For the first time, as employees are taking more responsibility for their careers, we're seeing organisations genuinely engage with all of their employees' attitudes, behaviours and who they all are. And this can only make for better organisations in any part of the world.
Thank you, and let's begin with Module 1.
I don't know about where you live, but in my country, if someone stands up to talk about globalisation, you can guarantee there will be a large and attentive audience. Some will come because they want to hear more about the ways in which economics and business are becoming more international. Some will come to learn how they and their businesses can take advantage of the huge global marketplace. And some will come to protest against what they see as a huge threat to local industry and culture and to the environment. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word globalisation first appeared in an article about the Italian car industry in a 1959 edition of The Economist magazine. 40 years later, the word globalisation appears so often and in so many different ways that it's easy to believe that something new is taking place, which is fundamentally changing the dynamics of life on Earth. The truth is a little less dramatic. As Professor James Petras from Binghamton University points out, foreign trade and overseas income was a greater percentage of world gross national product during the late 19th century than it is in the early 21st century. Nonetheless, globalisation is certainly having an impact on more and more parts of our lives. Though, as I hope to show in these presentations, not necessarily in ways which are immediately obvious. In recent years, as part of International Training Centre broadcasts, I have looked in great detail at the changing labour market. And for those interested in looking at more detail at some of these trends that I'm now about to mention, I invite you to go to the ITC website, where you can access all the previous presentations. During the first module of this program, I would like to focus on 4 key trends, and one what I might call a non-trend, which seem to me are increasingly evident across the developed world, and which inevitably seem to me to arise as workplaces are opened up to the global marketplace. Then, in the second module, I would like to explore how individuals and organisations might effectively respond to these trends. First, to my non-trend, which is best captured by this headline from the Wall Street Journal of 19 November last year, under the headline, "Working Without Workers. In lights out factories, machines still make things, even when no one is there." The article describes a number of plants in different industries which operate entirely without human intervention. It quotes one factory manager as saying, "The future of manufacturing for me is doing it whenever possible, with no labour at all. Articles like this worry many people who fear they mean higher unemployment. And in one way, they do. But the truth is that the amount of work which needs to be done in the world is not decreasing. Quite the opposite. There is now much more work which needs to be done than there are people willing and able to do it. Some kinds of work, like the jobs people once had in these lights-out factories, are certainly disappearing. But other kinds of valuable work still remain to be done. So whatever is happening in the world of work, there is no real shortage of real work to be done. Which leads me to say a little about what is actually happening in the changing world of work. The first trend I would like to discuss is a decrease in the number of full-time jobs and careers. With the possible exception of the United States, which is a special case because of its almost lack of serious minimum conditions legislation, the developed world stopped creating net new full-time jobs in the 1980s. Virtually all of the increase in employment in the past 20 years has been in part-time, temporary, seasonal and casual work. What full-time jobs have been created have merely replaced those lost through restructuring, downsizing and rationalisation. While it's true that in most countries the number of full-time jobs still comfortably exceeds the number of part-time jobs, in Australia the ratio is 3 to 1. The trend away from the creation of full-time jobs has been clear for over 20 years. Full-time jobs are simply not being replaced at the same rate as they are being lost. This trend makes individual workers increasingly responsible for managing their own working lives. The notion that an employer or a profession will provide a job, let alone a career, has largely disappeared. Hence, the subtitle of this presentation, Reinventing Ourselves for New Job Opportunities. The truth is simple. If we don't reinvent ourselves, we will be left behind. The reason for this is quite simple. In an environment in which the overwhelming majority of employees occupied a single full-time job for perhaps 20 years or more, as was the case just 30 years ago, it was easy to find a job. All the vacancies were posted in the same places, either out the front of the building or factory, or in the employment section of the paper. Nowadays, with work opportunities becoming more fragmented and less routine, those seeking work need to be more creative and persistent in discovering what needs doing and then explaining how they can help to get it done. The second trend which I'd like to highlight is the increased polarisation between the rich who have money but work long hours and the poor who have little or no work and a lot of time at their disposal. Of all current workplace trends, Perhaps this is the most insidious, since it means that except for a very small percentage of idle rich, both the middle class, because they're working such long hours, and the working class, because they lack adequate disposable income, both are being denied access to what used to be called a good life. This is just another example of the extent to which our current way of living is pushing many people away from a sustainable lifestyle. Neither working excessive hours nor having excessive free time is a sustainable way to live. And many commentators fear that a worldwide revolution against capital economics is inevitable as a result. This trend is readily visible in all our major cities, when the residents of those swank new high-rise apartment buildings in the centre of town have to step over the sleeping bodies of the homeless in their doorway when they do finally return home at night. It's also visible in the increasing inability of parents to find time to help their children with their homework. Not to mention the increasing number of teenage children who have to go to work as well as to school just to help the family make ends meet. I, for one, hope we can restructure our attitudes to work and life so that we can avoid what could only be a very destructive revolution. And I intend to have more to say about this during the second module of this presentation. A third trend is towards the adoption of the business model as the only way to organise people into action. 40 years ago, there were significant differences between the ways in which businesses, governments, educational institutions and community groups organised themselves to get their work done. Increased commercialisation has seen governments, educational institutions and community groups privatised and corporatised as the marketplace has expanded its scope. And in the process, a largely homogeneous business model has emerged as the dominant way in which all organisations and institutions are expected to organise themselves to do their work. Personally, I'm very worried about this trend. I worry that purely commercial organisations are too narrowly focused to be able to learn and to adapt from a changing world. Being primarily focused on providing a financial return to external shareholders necessarily limits the responsiveness of commercial organisations. I'm well aware of, and I applaud, movements striving to make businesses more socially and environmentally accountable. The term corporate citizenship is very appropriately being heard more and more often. But real change is hard to find, mainly because it's hard for the conventional, hierarchical, command and control business structure to successfully meet diverse and multiple needs. This issue of corporate accountability has been visible for some years, but has recently intensified with the collapse of organisations like Enron and the electricity crisis in California. Some people believe that trends towards so-called triple bottom line accounting will address this issue, but I'm not so sure. I believe that the problem lies deeper than that. It lies in the creation of the legal fiction that corporations are entities in their own right. I know the limited liability or joint stock company has significantly reduced the risks associated with undertaking new ventures. But the myth that an organisation has a life which its management is charged with protecting and nurturing has also allowed too many people to embark on inappropriate, if not illegal, behaviour and get away with it because they were acting in the best interests of the corporation. Whatever the solution, unless we are able to drop the myth that commercial organisations are the most effective ways to get things done, this trend will only intensify, and my worries will only deepen. Fourthly, I want to talk about speed, not the drug, but the increased pace of life in a global world. Whether we like it or not, any and all information can now be transmitted virtually instantaneously to anywhere in the world. This is one of those effects which, on the surface, appears to be a great step forward. How much easier is it to do business if you can track your products in real time as they move across the world, compared to having to wait 3 months to find out that your boat had sunk? But a deeper look suggests that opportunities for reflection and contemplation are hugely reduced when new information is continually arriving. It's easy to see how addicted we have become to the speed of information in our lives. All I have to do is to pause for more than 5 seconds. And instead of using the space to reflect on what's just been said, we reach for the controls to see if something's broken. How much of a challenge will this become if scientists succeed in connecting computers directly to human beings? This is probably not so far away. This article first appeared more than 12 months ago. Instant global communication also means your competitors can know what you know at exactly the same time. For example, in my country, as in lots of others, we now have global satellite positioning systems, which mean that when I call for a taxi, a computer can alert the car closest to me. This may mean a better service for me, but creates a real problem for the old-time skilled cab driver who used to be able to make more money than his mates because only he had the experience to know where the work was going to be. There is also the issue of the validity and accuracy of information. In the past, long, slow lines of communication mostly ensured that only relevant and reliable information was transmitted over long distances. Not anymore. There are more lies and errors on the internet than anyone cares to contemplate. Many doctors I know have been confronted by patients who have sought second opinions over the internet and arrived with inaccurate or misleading printouts from apparently official and reliable websites. And a similar challenge exists in the world of education, where assessing the quality of curricula offered over the web is often extremely difficult. No wonder security and privacy are such emotive issues in our emerging global world. A common feature of all four of these trends is a reduction in simplicity and certainty, and an increased expectation that all of us as individuals have to be more discerning and take more responsibility for the conduct of all of our lives if we're to be successful. This is a profound change from the world of our parents' generation, where the range of viable options available to individuals and to organisations was measurably smaller. During the second module of this program, I would like to suggest ways in which individuals and organisations might successfully respond to these trends. But first, I'd like to stop and invite your comments and feedback. What impact are these trends having on your life and inside your organisation? What other trends are you being confronted with which are also causing similar shifts?
So let's now move to the second module for our program.
Thank you for your comments, questions and feedback. In this part of my presentation, I want to make specific comments about how individuals, companies and institutions, and societies and governments might successfully respond to the changing workplace, which is being inspired by an increasingly global marketplace. I'd like to start with the last of my four trends, the changing nature of information. With information arriving rapidly and from many different sources, which seems to be the norm today, how do we know which information we should take seriously and what we should ignore? If we are to successfully reinvent ourselves in ways our modern world seems to require, then being able to distinguish a piece of interesting but unimportant information from a significant and meaningful trend is critical. Such analytical ability has always been in the arsenal of most successful people, but it is increasingly also demanded in all of us. Some of the ways in which successful people are able to identify and take advantage of important information which could easily be lost in noise include noticing if a particular message is being repeated, either because it arrives from multiple sources or because it recurs over time. Chances are, if it's repeated, it's important. Observing if others appear to be responding to particular pieces of information. Alert individuals can take advantage of useful information by observing the actions and reactions of others, even if they didn't notice it in the first place. Experimenting by responding to something which seems important and seeing if anything happens. The reverse is also possible, doing nothing in response to a message and being alert to what happens or doesn't happen. Successful people also talk things through with their mentors, trusted peers, or an inner circle of advisors. And this is actually an extremely important point. A particularly prevalent myth in our modern world is that of the ruggedly heroic individual who is successful because they have beaten the odds on their own. someone who's made it through hard work and personal endeavour. The media perpetuates this myth with stories both of successful entrepreneurs and battlers who have risen beyond anyone's expectation. I've probably been guilty of reinforcing this myth when I noted earlier that the changing world of work was requiring each of us to take greater control over our life's direction and to chart a course which works for each of us individually. There is, of course, some truth in this. Each of us does ultimately have to chart our own course if we are to be successful. But to suggest that we should or could do this alone is simply ridiculous. Even the most independent individual acknowledges the help of an inner core of people who have been with them every step of the way. These people have been mentor, conscience, forward scout, psychotherapist, muse or friend. Without them, not only wouldn't success have arrived, but even if it did, it wouldn't have meant much. My favourite example is Richard Branson, who is dyslexic and still doesn't even know his times tables. Yet he has been able to take on some of the most powerful companies and governments in the world and win. Read his book, Losing My Virginity, and see just how important a trusted circle of friends and advisors has been in his tremendous success. The modern world might be placing increasing responsibility on each of us for making our own lives work. But that doesn't mean we need to do it on our own. The exact opposite is true. Now, more than ever, we need friends and advisors to help us get where we're going and to share the success when we get there. Which leads me to say something about the role of companies and institutions in helping people make sense of the information which is bombarding them. First, to educational institutions. Right from preschool to tertiary education, and including corporate training departments, there is a need to move from teaching stuff to helping people learn to think for themselves, to analyse, to discriminate, to decide, and to reflect. This is not a new need, and there is now a plethora of curriculum material available on thinking skills and decision making. The fact that this is not in wider use reflects an innate conservatism in education systems which can no longer be excused. Virtually all the information anyone needs to do anything is now instantly available. Once, much of it was only in the heads of teachers and professors, but not anymore. What is in much shorter supply is people who know how to use this information to their own advantage. And that is a skill which can and should be taught from an early age. Educational institutions have in fact a special place as we create our future world. By their very nature, they and the people who are attracted to them are at the forefront of new knowledge and skill. Educators are, or ought to be, among those who are the most often confronted with new information or perspectives to challenge their current worldview. The notion of reconversion should be very familiar to those who are in the business of education and learning. However, too often their organisations are inflexible and are not creative enough to permit their employees and their students to experiment and explore new ideas. I'm very encouraged in my home country to see considerable emphasis being placed on getting the right people into positions of power and influence in educational institutions so they can regain their once eminent place as sources of growth and development. Incidentally, this reminds me of one of the ironies of the modern world. The skills of cataloguing, filing and retrieving information effectively are virtually mandatory for anyone who wants to be a success in their business life. Ironically, these skills were historically only taught to young women, who then applied them as secretaries and personal assistants. Now that we've replaced most of our secretaries with computers, these skills are even more important, but too many men still think they're beneath them and don't learn them. This might be a small reason why so many women are doing so well in their own entrepreneurial businesses and why so many men are failing. If educational institutions should be doing more to help people learn thinking and analytical skills, all organisations should be doing more to give their employees the opportunity to use these skills. Too many organisations are still organised in strictly hierarchical ways which restrict the way information gets inside the organisation and which try to control how it flows through. In this global world, you can never be sure where vital information will come from. Where once a small group controlled the flow of information through their elite clubs and private networks, now innovation and opportunity literally spring up from anywhere. Successful organisations in the future will be open to experimentation and learning. They will encourage the free flow of information, particularly inside the enterprise. And they will be well connected to, if not embedded in, their environment. Only then will they be able to successfully reinvent themselves as circumstances change. Now, not everyone will agree with what I've just said. Some will point out that freeing up information flow reduces security and increases the risk of subversion and sabotage. They will argue for prudent control over information in order to reduce the risk that it will fall into the wrong hands. Some will argue for the same controls on civil liberty grounds or to protect commercially sensitive material. These are real issues. As the United States found out on September 11, 2001, it was their own internal systems of pilot training which trained the hijackers. Similarly, many banks have found that the increasingly distributed nature of their information systems has led to increased employee fraud and embezzlement. These are not new concerns. This is a copy of an article from the January 1997 edition of Global Workforce entitled Global Business Under Siege, which focuses on just such threats. Different people will respond to these threats in different ways. I'm personally not surprised by current levels of sabotage and terrorism. These have always been a reaction to feelings of oppression or of being dispossessed. For me, they're not an argument for tightening up on information flow. Rather, they highlight an urgent need for greater compassion in dealing with those who feel threatened or displaced by increasing globalisation. I see this as directly related to the other trends I mentioned earlier in this broadcast. The demise of full-time jobs and the commercialisation of social services threaten many people. And it should be no surprise if people who feel threatened protest and rebel. These threats need to be confronted and resolved directly. They are real and they can't be covered up for long. They require governments and societies to provide short-term safety nets for those who are displaced, to reduce bureaucratic workplace legislation and regulation, and to dissolve service delivery to the community level so people can help each other rather than becoming dependent on a state bureaucracy. Slowly, this is being recognised, as is indicated by the 2001 report of the Panama Ministry of Labour and Human Development, which noted, and I quote, "The government's top priorities of poverty reduction and sustainable human development are simply not achievable without a substantial modernisation of how the workforce is trained and how freely workers can move and advance within the economy." But it's not only at the government level that these changes need to be dealt with. We all have an obligation to our own survival and to that of our children, and to confront the global challenge of change. First, we need to be prepared to tell the truth about the way things are. We do live in challenging and changing times, and some of us are coping better than others. This must be acknowledged, not just as some sort of inevitable and unavoidable consequence of a globalised world, but as a human and environmental tragedy. We cannot continue dispossessing people and damaging our planet, or our entire future is at risk. Telling the truth is an important first step in reconfiguring ourselves for a better future. And just as important is our sense of identity. Having a resilient sense of who you are, whether you are a person, a company or a country, is an important precursor to successfully responding to changing circumstances. How one acquires, maintains and modifies this sense of identity is a critical part of any reconversion process. The more global things become, the harder it is to maintain a sense of our own identity. At a national level, cultural history, language, and even native populations are all disappearing. And as a result, there is a disturbing trend towards cultural homogeneity, which, as I hope I demonstrated earlier in this broadcast, makes us much more vulnerable if things change quickly and unpredictably. At a corporate level, companies are becoming larger and more global, which inevitably means more homogenous. even smaller local companies are increasingly feeling that they can't survive unless they compete head-on in the same way their larger competitors do. And perhaps more profoundly of all, at an individual level, we all have an unprecedented opportunity to create and maintain a life which works for us as individuals, not as cogs in an industrial machine. Notwithstanding everything I've already said, I do believe there is altogether too much hype around the notion of reconversion. There is no doubt that being successful in the future requires more people to take more control over their lives than ever before. But this emphatically does not mean that we need to contemplate changing who we are every year, let alone every week. All that is required of us is that we stay alert to our environment, so that we become aware of impending changes earlier rather than later. In fact, this is perfectly natural behaviour, something our ancestors did for thousands of years. And it's really nothing more than ought to be required of the species which is in effective control of this planet. Our challenge for ourselves, inside our educational institutions, businesses or government entities, and in our societies and countries in general, is to learn how to engage the whole of who we are for all of our lives. And that is well within our capability.